we could share the agenda. Thank you. As usual, we will take just a few minutes to get any input from you and to see if you approve the last meeting's, the documentation from last meeting, which was April 22nd. So we'll look at that meeting summary. We'll see if you have anything to add. And then we will move on to public comment for items not currently on the agenda. We will then focus on the sustainable management criteria. We will receive a presentation from the technical consulting team. You'll notice that there were several materials that were sent out and posted to the agenda to support that discussion. We hope that the SMC technical memo and hydrographs were helpful and hope you were able to review those. We also provided an SMC summary tracking table so that you could see in all of the SMC together in a distilled form. Just because this is so much information, we're trying to make it as accessible as possible. And then we also did provide the a groundwater level monitoring wells table. So those materials were there for your reference to assist with the understanding of the SMC. We will propose a suggested action is for the Butte Advisory Board to make recommendations on the SMC today. Just to be clear that that's an important action we hope to be able to take. We will then spend just a brief amount of time because we anticipate today's discussion really needed to be focused on the SMC. We will spend a brief amount of time on the projects and management actions, giving you an overview of the PMAs and to for the technical team to sort of provide a preliminary PMA recommendations so that we can have some initial input just to make sure that we're on the right track so that the technical team can go away from this meeting and continue to work on developing the PMA chapter. And we provided some supporting materials for you, the PMA table there for your reference as well. And then we will just end with our usual sort of GSA updates if there are any that are applicable and important to share in this venue. And we wanted to point out that the GSP completion schedule has been updated. And we will want to, if we have a little bit of time, give an overview of that. If not, it is always there and available for you to take a much closer look. And ever, if you have any questions about the schedule or anything that's upcoming, do reach out to us. And we will attempt to adjourn at 3, although we do have quite a lot to accomplish today. And I wanted to welcome Hans Herkert from RD1004. I saw that you joined the meeting, so thank you for being with us, Hans.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, let us take a look at, just take a couple minutes here, and I'd like to ask if there are any questions or comments about the meeting summary from our April meeting. And if you do have anything, any corrections or questions of clarification that you would like to make, we will pull that up and so that everybody can see where your comments may lie. Thank you. Okay, I do not see any hands up or comments in the chat. So we do, I'd like to just go through and get your approval on this meeting summary so we can make it final on the website. So if I could just go through very quickly and check in with each of you. If you weren't here last time, you can just abstain from approving the meeting summary. I'll check in with Biggs West Gridley Water District.
I did not.
Okay, so you'll abstain from approving the document.
Yes.
Thank you. Supervisor Lucero from Butte County.
Abstain.
Thank you, Deborah. Butte Water District. Shelley Davis.
Abstain.
Okay. City of Biggs, Bo Shepherd.
Yes.
Thank you. City of Gridley, Mike Farr.
Yes.
CGA, Denise Carter.
Pretty sure I was here last time, so yes.
Thank you, Denise. Glenn County, Ken Hahn, Supervisor Hahn.
Abstain.
Thank you. RD 1004, Hans Herkert, on the meeting summary from the April meeting.
Yes.
Thank you. RD 2106.
Abstain.
Thank you, Danny. Richvale Irrigation District, Gary Stone.
Approved.
Thank you. And Western Canal Water District, Greg Johnson.
Approved.
Thank you very much. We'll make note of those who abstained since you were not here for that discussion, and we will finalize it and place that on the website. Thank you all for taking the time. And let me just turn it over to the public for a moment to see if you have any comments or questions about the meeting summary from our April meeting. Please do raise your hands if you do, using your reactions tab. Yes, Ben King.
Yes, hi, thank you. So I am a landowner right next to the Butte Basin, but also my family's owned land right next to the river south of the city for over 100 years. And I have a question really regarding the discussion around a slurry wall. I saw in some of the recent comments, the city of Biggs and the city of Gridley had some concerns about constructing a slurry wall. My concern is the potential slurry wall addition inclusive and how that may affect water quality, specific salt and arsenic. And so I wondered if at some point, if the concerns that have been discussed could be, if you could summarize that, because I'm interested in that discussion.
Thank you, Ben. We've noted your suggestion. I don't know if there are any members of the BAB or any staff members who have any thoughts in response to Mr. King's question.
This is Bo
Okay.
Shepherd. So if I understood correctly, is he talking about the past slurry wall that's been put up or a new one?
I'm thinking the new one. I'm not sure. I just saw a mention of a slurry wall additions that you might want to have a consultant look at that. My concern is, I'd love to have a slurry wall, but I'm concerned that actually putting additional slurry wall inclusive could the seepage that it prevent the seepage, but the seepage actually could be helping us keep the salt and the arsenic out of the city system or the wells close to that. So I just wondered what you guys were concerned about, because I just saw that, and maybe I'm totally missing the point, but I saw that there was some discussion about having some additional study about a slurry wall.
No, if I could clarify. So the slurry wall was put in on the west levee of the Feather River from Butte County to Sutter County. And people had brought up, I guess, questions. And I suggested that they have the executive director of the Sutter Butte Flood Control Agency come and answer any questions with respects to, the effects of a slurry wall that it has in, with groundwater whether it's affecting the aquifers or anything like that, because they have done enough. People have had questions, they've done research, and to my knowledge, they haven't found any effects negatively with respects to groundwater.
Well, that's correct. Okay.
Yeah, but it was just, if anybody wanted clarification, I felt like that Michael Bassett from the Executive Director of the Flood Control Agency would be the one to answer those questions.
Great. Okay, so it wasn't a concern about groundwater quality degradation. It was just like more of a general follow-up.
Tanya, this is Gene
Thank you.
Massa.
Go ahead, Jean.
I was the one that originally brought up the slurry wall. The slurry walls have actually caused problems despite what Mr. Bastet has said and some of his evidence. We're finding evidence to prove what they have contrary. The problem is the slurry walls, prior slurry walls, water would migrate from the Feather River into those areas adjacent. Once you put a slurry wall in, that stops that water from moving both ways. We've seen problems with water in wet years migrating from outside the river to the river and having to migrate all the way down along the river bank, along the slurry wall, and only moving into the river specific ports. I think we this year might be finding out the true ramifications of what the slurry wall may be doing with the groundwater levels because it's a very dry year. It was never anything to deal with water quality. It was more how the water moved from one side, from the river to the valley, from the valley side to the river.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the question and for clarification, Bo Shepherd and Jean Massa. Okay, let's go ahead, and I don't see any other hands. And so that's actually a good segue to public comment for items not on the agenda. This also is relevant to the Butte Advisory Board members if you have any comments for items not on today's agenda. So let me just take a moment and see if BAB members have any comments for items not on the agenda, and then I'll go to the public. Okay, seeing none, I'll just open it up to members of the public if you have comments for items that apply to the work of the Butte Advisory Board and that are not on today's agenda. And we do ask you to try to keep your comments to under 3 minutes, if at all possible. Just giving a moment in case folks are looking for what buttons to push. And I don't see any. Okay, so thank you very much. Today, because we are so focused on the sustainable management criteria, and we know that this is a complex set of criteria essential in this discussion as of developing a groundwater sustainability plan, I'd like to just pass it off to our technical consulting team. And Brian, before we get started, we do have some new faces on our consulting team that the BAB hasn't met. And so I'd appreciate it if you could introduce the team, let the BAB know what the changes are on the team, and then I believe Micah will be leading today's presentation. So Brian, why don't we start with you and an intro to the team.
Yeah, thank you, Tanya. I'd like to first off announce that John Ayers, who is leading the SMC work for Woodard and Kern for us, has left Woodard and Kern and joined DWR to review GSPs. So we're sure he won't be reviewing just this GSP, but we're hopeful his perspective of having worked on many GSPs may help with things. And we have replacing him from Woodard and Kern. I shouldn't necessarily say replacing him, but we've got Micah Eggleton and Leslie Dumas from Woodard and Kern. Now, they've both worked on multiple GSPs. Micah was helping John all the way along, so he's very experienced with this GSP. Leslie's working on Sutter. She worked on East San Joaquin, I think, and Delta Mendota for sure down south. in the critically overdrafted basin. So Micah's going to do the presentation and Leslie's supporting him, and maybe I'll give them just a couple minutes to introduce themselves. They can add a few words to what I've said. So we're really happy to have them both helping us here, and I'll hand it to them.
Micah, you want to go first?
Sure, yeah. Very happy to be here. Again, my name is Micah Eggleton. I've been working on GSPs for several years now. I honestly think this is probably like my 8th or 9th, maybe even 10th GSP. I've had a pretty heavy hand in and even more peripherally in our company. So I'm very excited to help out in this subbasin and here to support you with all of your questions and needs moving forward with the SMCs.
And I am Leslie Duma. I am a senior technical lead over at Woodard and Kern. And as Brian pointed out, I was the project manager leading the Delta Mendota, the Northern and Central Delta Mendota GSP, as well as all the coordinated work there, as well as implementing the Eastern San Joaquin GSP, consulted on the Merced one, and am currently the project manager for the Sutter GSP. So like Micah, GSPs have been consuming my life since 2016, 2017.
Well, thank you both, and welcome. We're glad to have you. And Micah, you're going to go ahead and share your own screen. Yes, there you go.
Yes. Yep. All right. So without further ado, I guess, I apologize, I'm looking off to the side here just to make sure I'm looking at the agenda. I'm going to be running through the SMCs today. I know that several of these slides you all have probably seen before. So I'm going to try and quickly go through that so we have enough time for discussion and any questions you might have. I'm happy to answer questions. If you want to throw up a hand, I might rely on Tanya or someone else to kind of flag me down because it's hard to see the thing on my second monitor. But feel free to ask me any questions as we run through this. I'd love to answer any questions and make sure that we're all comfortable with the SMCs that we're recommending. And then we'll stop at the end of every single sustainable management criteria to see if we can get a consensus on the recommendation moving forward for that particular sustainable management criteria or SMC. So we can start running through this. Again, we're going to touch on all 6 today. Some are not applicable in this basin, so it'll be really easy to breeze through. But we do have levels, interconnected surface waters, change in storage, seawater intrusion, degraded water quality, and inelastic land subsidence. First, let's quickly go over some of the terms that we're going to see. Often these are just space savers on slides, but it's important to remember that UR is an undesirable result. MTs are our minimum thresholds, or those red lines that we're going to see on some of the hydrographs. The MO is the measurable objective, that green line or goal that we would like to see throughout the implementation horizon of the GSP. Our MOOF, or margin of operational flexibility, is that distance between those 2 lines. We have our sustainability indicators, our groundwater levels, our quality, things like that. BGS is below ground surface. IM is interim milestone. And our PMAs is projects and management actions. Quickly again, let's review a very simplified hydrograph with some of our thresholds on it. You can see that this one projects out over the implementation horizon, or 20 years of the GSP. We have our interim milestones in those upside down blue triangles. Those are every 5 years when we reassess the GSP where we like to see us hit. So our green line is that measurable objective coming right across, and we try and make sure that our levels are hopefully around that area, but they can actually be anywhere in that margin of operational flexibility. That space in the gray is intended to allow things in the basin to happen, like drought periods, or maybe there's a land use change or something like that. It allows operational flexibility for the basin to operate and dig into those groundwater levels. This is just a groundwater levels example. Our minimum threshold is that yellow line, or anything below that can be considered an undesirable result, depending on how you define undesirable result. And we'll go into that a little bit in the presentation as well. So let's just jump into the first one, our chronic lowering of groundwater levels. We designed our representative network and we refined it down to have both wells in the shallow and deep aquifers. So we in our wells that are multi-completion wells, we selected a completion that is within that shallow aquifer zone, not every single completion within, often they have 3 completions in one cluster well. We usually chose the shallowest one, usually for that shallow aquifer refined network. And then on our deep network, we usually chose the deepest completion in that one. And we have these 2 maps that kind of show where our well locations are. Now, these are the refined groundwater representative network wells. So every single one of these diamonds has a threshold applied and calculated for them. So the pink diamonds on the left-hand side of your screen are our deep network, and the green ones on the right-hand side of your screen are the shallow representative network. You can see there's really good distribution. It totally meets the best management practices outlined or provided for Sigma. So these are really thorough networks. Any questions so far?
I have a question. Do we have numbers of domestic well users in the Butte Basin versus ag users? Total numbers?
I don't know that we have specific numbers like a survey result, but we do have analysis on the number of domestic wells per township range section that is provided by the DWR town. They have a database essentially that provides GIS data that has all that, and that's actually incorporated into how the SMCs are calculated. So we'll see a little bit of that later. That doesn't,
Okay.
I don't believe we've set out had a comparison between domestic concentrations versus ag concentrations within those scores, though.
All right, thank you.
I have a quick question, and I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself or the presentation, but how often are the shallow wells monitored or checked for change?
How historically or moving forward as a part of GSP implementation?
Historically or moving forward, either one.
Historically, it is completely dependent on the well. I believe one of my coworkers is the one who's actually worked with the majority of the data in the spreadsheet. I believe these are at least twice a year, but I believe they're mostly quarterly to monthly measurements.
Okay, thanks.
Great questions. Anything else before moving on? All right. So we calculate the minimum threshold using a 2-step process, and these might sound confusing at first. And why are we doing this? It's to ensure that we kind of account for all the local conditions around the basin in a straightforward way of providing the SMC calculation. So step 1 is we first use the shallower of either 100% of range below the historical low or the shallowest 7% of nearby wells, and that's domestic wells. And step 2 is to use the deeper of step 1 or just use the historical low. And I'll get into how each of those are calculated in the next few slides to show examples of what each of those mean. And then for our measurable objective, we use the average of the measurements from the last 5 years. Now that's not going to be a rolling average as we move forward. It just looks at the last 5 years of data. There have been questions about exactly how that's calculated, and we look at the last measurement that was collected in the data that was provided to us that ended in 2020, and say the last measurement was provided on my birthday, March 29th of 2020. That means that the 5-year average goes from March 29th, 2015 to March 29th, 2020, and we take that average and that's it. So to go into a little bit about the minimum threshold, how those were calculated, and this goes back to the domestic well concentrations. So we calculate the Tyson polygon of domestic well depths for each of the monitoring wells. So a Tyson polygon essentially creates each of these, oh, and I should pull up where's my little pointer? My pointer in here? Yes. So if we look at this well with the 8 in the polygon over here and the well with the 4 over here, that means there are 4 domestic wells in this entire polygon. That means there are 8 in this polygon over here. And these polygons are developed because this line going between these two wells, this pink one and this pink one, this line represents the exact middle between those 2 points. So it's equidistance from here to this well and from here to this well. And that's how we and we use that using the DWR's database for domestic wells using township, section, and range. Now, that database is the best available data. It, however, is not always 100% accurate. So the reason we've chosen 7% of wells is because some of those wells are discontinued or have been destroyed or abandoned, and it isn't updated as much as it probably should be. So there's some error that we try and account for. We don't want to be protective necessarily of 100% because that's probably not the most realistic value in there. But we've done this Tyson polygon for both networks, as you can see, the shallow and deep. And when we say we are protecting up to the 7th percentile of nearby domestic wells, that means that if that polygon had 100 wells, then 7 could be dewatered if we were below that threshold. Simple way of looking at it on this figure right here is, say we were trying to protect the 20th percentile of wells. There are 10 wells in this example, which means well 4 and well 9 would be above that 20th percentile line, and the other 8 are below it. So we're protecting 8 of the 10 wells. If we were looking at the 50th percentile, well, then 5 of our wells would be below the line and 5 would be above. So that's why we've done it for every single polygon. It uses the best available data that we have access to, and is something that several basins across the state have been utilizing. And you can kind of see over in this map on the right-hand side, each of these green dots it corresponds, and you can kind of see how many of them are grid shaped and form squares. It's the centroid of that section, township, range data file that the state provides. And that was a lot of
And Jeanette?
Yes, please.
One moment. Ann Jeanette had her hand up first. If you wouldn't mind using your reaction tab, it will just help me maintain the queue. Supervisor Lucero. Ann Jeanette?
Yeah, Micah, so I totally understand the protection of the wells, but this is not with respect to age of the well, what's the construction of the domestic well, was it hand dug? I mean, some of those things would be interesting to know, or maybe take the approach of taking a more investigative approach before, I don't know what we've decided what the hammer is going to be, but it would be interesting to know what we're actually protecting.
Yep. Yeah, it's been brought up, especially in other basins, about doing a full well inventory. That's, it requires a good amount of work to be able to go through these, and not all of the well completion reports are included online. There are some summary data available associated with the GIS file and the table, but that's definitely something that could be a project management action later to definitively maybe pull some of those wells out. And but yeah, like I said, that 7% kind of helps us not be too restrictive and account for some of those wells that are very old and not used anymore, might be hand dug or whatever. So,
and I would also add that also in some other basins, in addition to doing kind of the well census, is they're starting well registry programs, asking well owners in the GSA areas to voluntarily register their wells so that they can at least get firsthand information as to not only what's out there, but what the owners know about how their wells were constructed and how old they are.
yeah, thank you, Leslie.
Thank you. That's really helpful information. We'll go to Deborah Lucero in a moment. I just want to remind those who are participating today that we had a similar presentation that John Ayers gave last time, and we received really good inputs from BAB members. And you'll recall that the technical team presented a range of options. And those of you who were present, there was a 5th percentile, 10th percentile, and the input that the technical team received was, could you hit somewhere in between for your minimum threshold? And that's where the 7th percentile comes from. Just wanted to make sure that we're following the line of the discussion from last time. And Supervisor Lucero?
I just had a follow-up to Ann Jeanette's question. So within each one of these areas that you've identified, it does include all of the wells that are according to the DWR data. Is that correct?
All of the
Okay.
domestic classified wells.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And yet we don't know what the total of all those wells are in each section. Nor do we
Total
know
number
the
of wells
depths.
or total depths.
Yeah.
We do know the data provides a total number of wells in that area. So that's why we have 8 here. And this, granted, this is for the deep aquifer, which is why we see much lower numbers. And over here, we can see that there are much more like Biggs. There are 146 domestic wells in this area. The summary data provided by DWR does have the shallowest, median, and deepest domestic well within that polygon of the section township range.
Okay.
Great questions.
I don't see any other hands, Micah.
All right, let's keep moving. Quickly, again, this is just to show how we calculate that 100% below range. This is an example hydrograph I drew several years ago by squiggling on my screen with a mouse. But if this were a real well, we can see that the historical data goes from 20 feet below the ground surface to 60 feet, which means we have a range of 40 feet in this particular well. So 100% of range below the historical low for this example well would be 60 plus that 40 feet downward to get at a threshold of 100 feet. So that's how we calculate that. So let's go over 2 example hydrographs, this being our first one. If you remember, we have those 2-step processes. On all the hydrographs that we export, we provide what the eventual method and how that was calculated for the particular well, the thresholds, down at the bottom of each hydrograph. So when we see the final ones in the report, it'll also include how those thresholds were set. For this one, we can see that the green line is around the last 5 years of measurement data, these blue points. This orange line is the model data out to 2068. And we can see from this hydrograph that our MT calculation method is 100% of the historical range below the historical low. So it's the range of all these blue dots. Now, because of the x-axis on this hydrograph, we have blue dots going out past or before 2000. And sometimes this well hits ground surface, and some wells even have artesian conditions in the past. So we can see that this range of the blue dots is where this red line is down below the minimum. If we go to our second example, same kind of thing. We have 100% of historical range as the method. So the range of all of our blue dots is almost 40, which means that just below about 38, 37, add another 38, 37, and we get the red line around these, or 73 feet on this one. We've also included all the values down here. So does anyone have any questions on these example hydrographs? And Jeanette?
Yeah, I'm unmuting myself on my cell phone, so I'm sorry if it shows me unmute the whole time. So the measurable objective is just something where we're trying to stay in that range, and we're trying not to stay under the minimum threshold for an extended period of time, correct?
Yes. Yeah, green
Okay.
line is our goal. We don't have to hit it. The state can't get us in trouble for being within this operational flexibility area right here, because that's the entire point of it. If we hit drought conditions, it's fine. And because of the way we set our minimum threshold, it's the average of the last 5 years. Well, then roughly half of the last 5 years, we've been below the measurable objective. So, which is totally fine, because half the time we've also been above it.
Right. So that brings me to my other question. So the last 5 years also included a drought. And I'm not sure if you guys looked at this, and I don't know if we've ever brought it up before, but do we compare those to the last drought, either in the 77 period drought or the 92-ish early drought?
I have not personally compared it with either of the 2 previous droughts, but you are right. The 2015 drought is included. I mean, we see that right here with these 3 dots. And that's intentional for two reasons. One, it's a drought period and droughts happen. It's cyclical, right? So we wanted to be able to provide a measurable objective that is realistic over the long term. We've seen drought conditions in the past. It helps provide a little bit of context for where we want our goal to be in the future. And also Sigma puts in the regulations that the GSA is not responsible for improving conditions before 2015. And so 2015 is kind of this magic number in Sigma land, where you don't have to use that as your justification, but a lot of places do kind of point to the 2015 drought and say, well, conditions were pretty bad around here, or it was a tough time for us. But this is realistic because it's a drought period and we don't need to get any better than this necessarily. So that's why we definitely take into account the 2015 drought for that reason, the measurable objective.
Yeah.
And Supervisor, go ahead. You have
I
a
was just
follow-up,
going to add
Anjanette?
one thing, if I could, excuse me.
Okay, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I was just, where we have data, why that would be considered the, for some wells, we have data for the earlier drought. I think we have very few, if any, wells that go back as far as 1977. But to the extent that we have data, why it's in the data set, and we don't have the minimum here. It could be that there's slightly lower values in one of the earlier droughts, but that will be taken into account in the calculation of the range if that data exists. So
great point. Thank you, Brian. Yeah. So if the minimum in the previous drought, and I apologize, imagine this hydrograph going out here. If the minimum was down here, well, that still impacts the historical range calculation. All the data, all the historical data is used. It's not cut off at 2000. Thank you, Brian.
That's very helpful. Thanks for that clarification. Supervisor Lucero?
I was just wondering if you have done a hydro graph for more populated areas like Biggs or Gridley.
We have hydrographs for every single one of the representative wells in the network. So we've looked at all of them. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Are those in the in our packets?
I believe so. Yes.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
they are.
Okay. All
Yeah,
right.
They are
and how?
Go ahead, Deborah.
I'm just wondering how I would know. I guess just by the number, the amount of information on the graph, or.
We do. Have we provided, Brian? Have we provided a map of where these well locations are?
yeah, so the hydrograph packet begins with a short tech memo that describes what's in the packet. Then there's a map with the state well number for each well. Then there's a map of the minimum thresholds for each well. And then these hydrographs have the state well number, so you can tie the state well number back to the map to see a map near Biggs, for example.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. Seeing no other questions, I'm going to move on. Great. So to our recommendation slide. So this is the one where we're seeking input afterwards, your recommendation moving forward. But the technical team is recommending that minimum thresholds use that two-step process. So step one, again, is use the shallower of either 100% below range or the historical low. 100% of the range below the historical low, or the shallowest 7th percentile of nearby wells, so protective of 93% of domestic wells in the area. And then step two is to use the deeper of step one or the historical low. Then we suggest the measurable objective be set at the average of the last 5 years of measurement. And what's really important is the undesirable result detection. So just because we fall below a minimum threshold line for one period record or even two, doesn't mean we're necessarily in an undesirable result across the basin of how we've defined an undesirable result in previous presentations and discussions. So an undesirable result is detected after 25% of monitoring representative wells fall below their minimum threshold for 24 consecutive months. So that gives it 2 years where 25% and the same 25% of wells need to fall below that red line before the state can come in and enact or do something or take over a little bit or force some kind of projects and management action. That is to be protective of those drought periods that might be more severe. We've already incorporated droughts into how the thresholds are set, but those 2 years and 25% are intended to be really protective of the basin and make sure that projects and management actions can be implemented before an undissolved result actually occurs. And just for reference, 25% is 3 of the 12 wells in the deep aquifer and 11 of the 41 wells in the shallow aquifer representative network. And I already see hands up, so go ahead, Anjanette.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to make sure we're clarifying all this because this is getting released for public comment July 1st. Is that right?
That's a Brian question.
Yes, that's the
Brian.
plan. We're on track to do that.
Okay, so I might be asking a little bit more questions than usual, so I apologize. There was a set of graphs that went out with the technical memo that's on the website right now. And I'm not sure if now is when you want comments on our individual. There was a reference document for each GSA, what the measurable objective is and what the minimum threshold was. And I didn't know if you wanted comments on those now, if we had any changes, or if you're proposing any changes that might be already on the website that nobody else, or that we haven't been able to review yet.
I think we're looking for comments now, right, Tanya?
We do want to balance it. If it affects, I think if it affects a GSA's ability to make a recommendation on these proposed SMC, definitely. And we just want to balance that with the fact that we do have limited time and we have to get through the other SMC. So Anjanette, does that make sense? What are your thoughts? Do you think it's critical to make those comments right now?
Well, I just want to know when you're going to call for them, because we do have comments at Western Canal, and there might be some from other districts as well, or other GSAs, sorry.
Mm-hmm. And are those comments that you think can be provided when the draft chapter comes out, or it's important to get in front of that and provide the comments before the draft chapters is released?
I think it's important to do it before they're released.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's see. Let's see. We should probably hear what those comments are, and we at least need to get a sense of how significant they are. So go ahead. Is this a good time then to the technical team for us to hear that, or is that something you want to do after going through all the SMC?
I think now is probably a good time so that we can go through it now, and then we'll take what time we need.
Well, I think just generally, and I'm only speaking for the wells, there's also a cross-reference on the website, if people didn't notice that, so they could look at their specific GSAs. But if the minimum threshold for just groundwater-dependent ecosystems is 30, I don't see why there should be any M&T above that. That's a general comment. And then, so that for Western Canal would affect 1, 2, 3, 4 of our calcium IDs, 4 of the wells. So that's a general comment. And then, so I would request probably anything under 30 should go to 30. And then for specific calcium IDs, I can send those to you, and recommendations for going to at least 30 or maybe a little bit deeper by 10 feet. Especially if they're not even an area of a GDE.
So
I have to look and see what the polygons are for the, I know we're trying to be protective of domestic wells. So that would maybe, I don't know what that number is of domestic wells and the other ones that I'm proposing to go around.
So let me take a crack at this, and then Mike, you can, and Leslie, you can chime in and help be sure that I'm technically correct from a geohydrology standpoint. But first off, a couple things I want to say, noting this, there's only 3 wells where the limiting factor was the shallowest domestic well. There's only 3 wells there, and there's 2 wells where the limiting factor was the historical low. So on the 2 wells where the historical low is the limiting factor, why the technical team has noted that basically if you're setting the minimum threshold at the minimum at the historical low, why there's no operational flexibility below that historical low. So I think we've talked about it some internally. We noted these wells, they happen to be, well, they're on the very eastern edge of the sub-basin. I think in Butte County, the two wells I'm talking about are in Butte, in the county of Butte, just outside, just on the very eastern edge. Yeah, I don't know if you want it, you can probably just below the Thermalito after bay to the east of Biggs, those 2 there. So those, I think, to add 10 feet to that historical low makes sense. It's consistent with other things that we're doing and gives some operational flexibility at those 2 wells. So I think that's a change that we would recommend here. And then with respect to the
if I may interrupt really quick, Brian. So essentially those hydrographs, and we'll have to be a little imaginative here. These blue lines or blue dots are much closer together at a higher depth, which means that the difference between the top and bottom wells is very low. And so the historical low, essentially, the red line would be going through it. And we're just proposing that maybe we add 10 feet to it because the range is so much smaller that 10 feet we feel would allow greater operational flexibility in this well in the future. Now, that still means that it's lower than the historical low, so it might not get there, probably won't get there, but it just adds a little bit more protection because that range is much smaller.
Micah, let me ask you something. Do you think it would be beneficial? I don't want this to become cumbersome, but do you think it would be beneficial to go ahead and look at those hydrographs when we're referring to them?
I have it up, so if you want to stop sharing, I can share my screen and we can look at one example.
I think that'd be very helpful. I just stopped sharing, so go for it.
So and you can keep describing it if you want. I could take a first crack at it. So do you see my screen now with the hydrograph?
Yes.
And my little hand, you can see, maybe, I hope.
Yep.
Circling, so you can see where the red line for the minimum threshold goes right through a blue dot. So that was a historical low. So we would move this 10 feet lower to 59 feet, and the red line would go right kind of where the 60 feet is. So you see, we would then add operational flexibility to this area. So that's, the other well is essentially the same. You've got the red line going right through the historical low. And then we would move that down to provide a little bit of extra operational flexibility there. So that's.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. So Brian, again, just to clarify this, this is just 2 wells where this phenomenon has occurred. And you're suggesting for these 2 wells that you would then create a 10-foot buffer for the MT just for those wells. And then it's, I think, important to emphasize something else that you said, that only 3 wells in the basin, the limiting factor was the 7th percentile of domestic wells. So essentially what you're saying is that these MTs are more protective, I mean, given the conditions of the basin, more protective than the 7th percentile, except for on those 3 wells where that was the limiting factor.
That's correct, yeah. So.
Did you have any follow-up there before we go to Supervisor Lucero, whose hand is up?
So this is one place that we would recommend changes, and then Anjanette, what she's brought up a couple other changes. So do we want to go to the question first and then come back to a second change?
Yes, let's see. It might be a clarifying question. We'll want to make sure that everybody is following along, since this is pretty technical information. Supervisor Lucero.
Thank you. Well, my comment is on, it's difficult to follow these hydrographs. For one thing, the pages aren't numbered. And it might be helpful to have numbers on the pages to refer to these. If a person wants to make a comment, I understand that you're wanting them to go perhaps with the SWN 180, N03, all of that stuff up at the top. But I think that because this is so technical, it seems like you need another reference on a page number or something.
It's noted. We can prepare a second
Okay.
set of page numbers to issue after the meeting.
Okay, thank you for that follow-up.
The monitoring well reference document is on the website, so that's going to be more helpful. It also has the gas gem number, so that might be helpful in the interim.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the final report. If somebody wanted to make a comment, it might be helpful to have a page number. That was really the comment. So,
thank you. It sounds like we're going to follow up with that information. Okay, going to Anjanette, at your other comments here.
So let me see if I'll quickly find an example. I hope nothing's moving. You know, when I flip through these, the red line is below all the historical, generally a fair amount. And then I'm going to find, I hope. Here we go. So I think this is one of the wells that you were concerned about, Anjanette. Are you still muted?
I'm sorry, I had a question from an employee, so I missed whatever you just said.
Okay, so I think this is one of the wells you're concerned about as an example. It has the minimum threshold 14 feet.
Yes, correct.
Based on the criteria where we take in this one note, it's the 100% of the historical range. So basically, we look at the deepest level measurement and the shallowest level measurement and the difference between that. And then we add that difference to the deepest, and we only end up with 14 feet. So it's kind of hard to see here, but it's, it's probably like a range of 7 foot or something like that gets added to the deepest level being only 7 foot below ground surface. So we end up with a minimum threshold pretty high. So what we're recommending is that instead of using simply the 100% of the range, we use either the 100% of the range or 20 feet to add to that deepest depth. So that, for example, on this one, if we added 20 feet to the deepest depth, we would end up at about 30 feet, I think.
Yeah, and I'm good with that because, again, the protection, I don't even think there's any GDEs in that area anyway, but I think 30 feet is reasonable. And it follows along with the other criteria we've established.
So as a technical team, Micah, Leslie, you're okay with that, where we would change this criteria so that we had at least 20 feet of operational flexibility below the deepest measured level.
yes, that's.
And Jeanette, Anjanette, this is a well within Western's jurisdiction, yes?
Correct.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm clarifying that for everyone. Micah, I'm sorry, I stepped on you there.
No. I was just saying that I think this is totally fine. I've been updating the slide live, so when we go back to my presentation, we can see it in text.
And I'll just add that we will need to go back and reapply the revised criteria to all the hydrographs so that we're consistent across the board.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. That's helpful, and we appreciate you doing that. Okay, and Anjanette, were there other wells? We just looked at that one. Were there others?
There's other ones, but I think the technical team gets the gist of what I'm saying, and I can provide them specifically, but they all follow the same issue as that one, and they're within Western.
Okay, so within your jurisdiction, there are a handful of these wells, and from what I've heard from what you've said there is that you're comfortable with the methodology, the revised methodology that they've suggested to apply to those wells.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
My comment.
All right.
Excellent.
So
okay, Micah.
Can everyone see my screen now? Back again, the slideshow. Great. So just to be absolutely clear, I've put up the changes that was just discussed in red on this slide. So we use for setting the minimum threshold, and remember this is for the groundwater level monitoring network. Step 1 is to use the shallower of 100% of range below the historical low, or the shallowest 7th percentile of nearby wells. The caveat new entry being, if 100% of range is less than 20 feet, then we just use 20 feet as our historical range. Step 2 is use the deeper of step 1 or the historical low plus 10 feet. So not historical low, that red line won't be going through the historical low. It'll be 10 feet below that historical low for those two wells, essentially. We all on the same page? Any questions on that?
Just a clarification, maybe I'm misunderstanding this. I think that the methodology, when we just applied it to that other well, it was an additional 20 feet below the historical low, which in that case was 30 feet.
Oh, is that right, Brian? It's 20 feet plus the historical range? You're on mute.
So I think what you've written here is the way we were thinking about it. So for step 1, it's either the range or 20 feet, whichever is greater. So that you would add 20 feet to the historical observed depth. And in step 2, we were talking about adding just 10 feet to the historical depth.
The it doesn't necessarily need to be 100% of range plus 20 feet. I think that might bias some of the wells that, we're talking about the wells that don't have much range already, but for those wells that maybe have 19 feet of historical range, I don't necessarily want to use that. If it were 19 feet plus 20, I wouldn't necessarily want it to be 49 feet. So I think probably just adding the 20 below the historical low is probably a better bet to be more consistent with the historical measurements of that well.
Yeah, we were thinking it would be 20 feet below the historical, not 20 feet added to the range. So that way your minimum operational flexibility below the historical is 20 feet. But if you've got a bigger range at a well, you would have more than 20 feet as is operational flexibility.
All right, any questions on this? I appreciate all the feedback. I know this gets really complicated and it's shallower of these through and then the deeper of this, and we just added another little step in here.
Great.
So happy to answer any questions on this because this gets confusing. And I apologize for always looking off to the side. I'm looking for head nods or hand raises.
I don't see any hands, and thank you for that clarification.
All right, so I think we are seeking feedback. Are we doing a vote, Tanya, or are we just silences?
Yes, so
Thumbs up.
I think we really do want to take the temperature here because we're seeking, we are seeking recommendations from the BAB. And so would like to check in with each of the BAB members, just going in order, sort of doing a roll call here on these recommendations with that adjustment that has been made. And then we'll see if there are any questions from the public. So going to, I actually am going to go in reverse order and I'll alternate. So I want to start with Western Canal. Please let us know if you're comfortable with the recommendations with that adjustment that has been made for this SMC.
I'm good with it as it's been restated with the adjustment.
Thank you, Greg Johnson. I'm going to Richvale Irrigation District, Gary Stone.
Yes, we're good with that.
Thank you, Gary. RD 2106,
Hey,
Danny
Tony,
Robinson.
this is Sean. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sean.
I'm sorry
Sean,
about
did
that.
you have a follow-up?
Hey, there's a couple of wells I've been looking at as well. Yeah, I've got your text one right here. Can you help hear me?
Oh, your audio is garbled. Can you try again there, Sean?
Can you hear me now?
No, it's still it's still quite bad. Maybe if you could type in chat if you're able to do that. And let me come back just for time, the purposes of time, let me come back to you and I'll check in with others. So going to RD 2106, Danny Robinson.
We're okay with it, Tanya.
Thank you, Danny. RD 1004, Hans Herkert.
Yeah, okay with the changes.
Thank you. Glenn County Supervisor Ken Hahn.
Yes, we're okay with it.
Thank you. CGA Supervisor Carter, Denise Carter.
Yes, I'm good with it.
Thank you. City of Gridley, Mike Farr.
Yeah, as best I can understand it, I agree.
Okay, and do Mike let us know if there's some follow-up, if there's still areas that aren't clear. But thank you. City of Biggs, Bo Shepherd.
Yes, and so just to clarify, we are really only talking about those 3 particular wells that are in Western's area.
Where this, what we are talking about, we are getting your recommendation on this SMC for groundwater levels. Correct. And there has been a caveat made for those wells where there is this anomaly, sort of the, as described by Brian, where that 20 feet was added. So
Yes.
that methodology would apply to those handful of wells. And there may be some in Richvale, but we need to go back to Sean because his audio was poor and we couldn't hear him.
There are 2 wells that utilize the historical low below 10 feet. There are 2 wells that utilize the shallowest 7% of nearby domestic wells. And then there are about, oh goodness, I think 5, 6, maybe 7 wells that would then fall under this or 20 feet, which is whichever is greater additive. There are only a handful of those wells. Now these 2 bullet points apply to every single well within the representative network. It's not like we have separate criteria for every single GSA. But this just encompasses and kind of hits each of those wells, so we don't have to worry about something like management areas and signal. So it's technically applied to all of them. how many wells this actually impacts is 2, 2, and about 5.
And if I could just add, sorry, this is Leslie, it's basically a methodology for establishing your minimum thresholds. And it's important that you have a methodology because as you move forward towards your 5-year update and beyond that, you're going to be adding wells and modifying your representative monitoring networks. And so you want to have a basic consistent methodology that you're applying across all wells that enter into your representative monitoring network.
Okay,
Thank you, Leslie. And did that clarify it for you, Bo? And I, Micah, really appreciate your precision there in describing which methodologies would apply to how many, the number of wells. Bo,
Yes, it did.
Are you comfortable
Thank you.
with this?
I am. Thank you.
Good question.
Thank you. Butte Water District, Shelley Davis.
Yes, we're in agreement with that.
Thank you, Shelley. Butte County Supervisor Lucero.
Yes, with the explanations, I was just wondering if it would be protective enough for those domestic well users. And it sounds like it will be if it's affecting just 5 or 6 of the wells that have been discussed.
Thank you, Deborah. And Biggs West Gridley Water District, Cheryl Gordon.
Yes, we're okay with it.
Thank you. And do we need to go back to Sean? I understand that he's in a place where he can't get better coverage. And Jeanette, do you have, or Gary, do you have any insights into what he was going to raise?
Yeah, I don't. Sean and I haven't had a chance to talk about that, so just wanted to defer to him. Obviously, we can't get that insight.
And Jeanette, do you know of what who was going to get in, who wanted to get in the conversation?
Well, all I know is that he was taking a deeper look. There's been I think everybody understands the drought and the drought conditions with Oroville and operations and how it's affected the Feather River District. That's taken up most of his time last week, and he just didn't get a chance to look at this better. That's all I know.
Okay, thank you. Well, I wonder if, you know, if the application of this slight adjustment here to some of this handful of wells, if this may address his concern. Not because we don't know that for sure, or if he was going to raise such a concern, but we have, let's see if we can follow up with him. Otherwise, we have heard from all of the GSAs, and it seems that with this revision that there is support for this recommendation. And let me just take a pause here and open it up to the public to see if there are any follow-up questions before we go to the next SMC. I don't see any, so Micah, we can go on.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, thank you for all the wonderful feedback. I think these are really good revisions, and I would just like to say thank you because getting groundwater levels nailed down, the recommendation is a huge step. So thank you everyone for all your great questions and input. This is excellent. I'm really glad we can move forward. So let's keep going. Our next sustainability indicator is we'll be talking about our depletions of interconnected surface waters. We try to focus on the key water bodies throughout the subbasin, and for this basin, it's Sacramento River, Feather River, Butte Creek, Little Dry Creek, and Angel Slough. So these are the ones that we look at when looking at interconnected surface waters. We try to do a comparison of the shallower monitoring network wells, surface water proximity, and probable GDE locations when we look at these representative monitoring sites. And if you look at the map on the screen right now, you can see that we have these gray strips following these water bodies throughout the basin. And these gray strips are between 2,000 feet and 7,280 feet. And the reason we do that is because any closer to these surface water bodies, really the stream flow is really influential in those, but our groundwater, surface water interaction and the gray strips that we've specified here are the areas that we're looking at for a lot of our wells and GE locations, which are also plotted in green. I'm going to take a quick pause and talk about groundwater dependent ecosystems. Now, specific thresholds to groundwater dependent ecosystems are not in themselves a groundwater sustainability indicator. It's part of Sigma regulations, part of the groundwater conditions discussion needs to address groundwater dependent ecosystems. There have been a lot of work with NGOs working with the state to get groundwater dependent ecosystems as a part of these plans. And so it is something we need to address, but it's not something that has its own network dedicated for independent of these. It has to fit within our 6 sustainability indicators. So our groundwater dependent ecosystems, we look at local species, and for Butte Subbasin, we're looking at the Valley Oaks, which have a rooting depth of 30 feet, which is why 30 feet is a number we've been hearing a lot throughout these discussions. We try to monitor these locations and these groundwater dependent ecosystems using existing wells near those GDE locations that are on the map. We may use a separate monitoring network of very shallow wells, less than 50 feet. This would require installing some new wells, but this is also, if we install these wells, it's also very helpful in monitoring interconnected surface waters, which is why I'm talking about it right here. So when we look at our current network, we can see that there are some areas that could definitely use some improvement in terms of monitoring to focus around these GDEs and interconnected surface waters. We've circled 10 of them on this map here. We have recommended locations. We have some cost estimates roughly based in this, or shown in the slide, because that's often what a lot of the GSAs immediately start thinking about is how much is this going to cost us to install these wells. So it's about $7,000 to $9,000 per well. So we estimate around $80,000 to $100,000. That aside, let's go back to the thresholds that we'd like to recommend on these wells. We recommend using 10 feet deeper than the 2015 low measurement, which is a drought period. And our measurable objective is going to be the exact same that we used in the groundwater level monitoring network, which is the average, a non-rolling average of the last 5 years of measured data. Again, that was my example of my birthday from March 29th, 2015 to March 29th, 2020. If March 29th, 2020 was our last measurement in our data set. So let's look at a few example hydrographs. Again, often in these interconnected surface waters, we see levels that are a lot shallower in these wells. So over here, this might even been one of the examples we were just looking at, the last sustainability indicator. You can see that our green line is the average last 5 year measurements. We incorporate that drought period in 2015. It's dipped down, which is why it's the green line is a little bit lower in this blue stretch. And our depletions of interconnected surface water minimum threshold, this red line, is that 10 feet deeper than historical lows. So it's 10 feet below this blue dot. Same thing over here. Green is the average last 5 years. And this red line is 10 feet below this blue dot right here, which is the minimum of 2015. Any questions on this so far? Oh, okay. Yep, Deborah.
Sorry, I'm playing somewhat catch up on this,
Oh,
but
no
does that mean then if you're saying that the GDE, we know that live oaks go down 30 feet, what does that show in terms of where we begin to monitor the depletion of interconnected surface water? Is that within that threshold of 30 feet?
Are you asking how the minimum threshold for something like this well is protective of that interconnected?
Right. If you're saying that a live oak takes it, it roots at 30 feet, what would this example show?
So the important thing to remember for this one is not where our representative wells for interconnected surface waters don't always have GDEs at that location. So we're looking at we still have shallow networks around the water bodies, which is why 50 feet for, I'm not exactly sure which one of the wells that example hydrograph was at. But even though the minimum threshold was, I think it was like 48 feet or something on that hydrograph, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's in one of these GDE areas. What
I
we're
see.
the discussion of the GDEs is really just brought up here because there is a good amount of overlap, and some of those wells are near these GDE locations. We'd like more wells in these GDE locations, but that expands not only our GDE monitoring, but our surface water, our interconnected surface water monitoring network. So that's why I think I answered your question a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Good question, though. All right, seeing no other questions. I wanted to bring up this example right here. If we look at these 3 wells within this red circle, it shows that levels can be lower the further away you are from the water bodies, while still avoiding undesirable results based on how we define undesirable results and their identification. So if those 3 wells that we just saw in that circle are these 3 wells kind of in the same orientation. You can see that our groundwater levels or our interconnected surface water threshold, pardon me, for this well is a little bit higher, but totally conforms to the general trend of the measurements provided in this hydrograph. In the middle, where it's away from the surface water bodies, there are no GDEs in the area. It's part of the regular groundwater level monitoring network. We can see that our groundwater levels minimum threshold is a little bit lower because we see more variation over here. Totally fine. And over here in this well, we see we do have some more variation than maybe this well in general, but still 10 feet is still very protective. We haven't seen depths over here, so it gives us some breathing room, operational range of flexibility. But our goal is to be around here, which is totally within the historical range around 2015, and is protective of interconnected surface waters at this location. So just kind of showing that even though everything is in the basin mixed up, the way we've calculated and set these thresholds is very representative to where each of these wells are.
Danny has his hand up. Danny Robinson.
Yeah, so I have a question. We bring surface water in and it goes on top of the ground, and I'm right next to the creek. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm kind of doing my own application of water on top. That makes sense. And so I'm curious if what's the value of that and what value we show of that in something like this. Are you following what I'm saying? We're at Llano Seco Ranch. So we're bringing water in on the top. You get where I'm going? And it's dropping in through a ditch and going all over towards the refuges and all that beautiful stuff there. So that's kind of recharging. Are you able to show how my well goes up when you're measuring it?
Well, it depends on when. So the answer is going to have a few different parts. So if your well is measuring, or if the local groundwater conditions on your ranch are getting water from surface applications and thus some recharge, and it's in here, the historical record, all the blue dots for those wells are essentially incorporated into how these thresholds are calculated. So that's one way that we incorporate local conditions based on those wells. And maybe it's not, maybe it's one of the USGS wells and it's not the well you own, but if that well is close enough to your ranch, it's still getting some of those conditions influencing the levels in that well. Also, if you have surface applications, the orange line of this model data out to 2068 also incorporates things like precipitation, percolation, applied water, stuff like that. So this model result, orange line, also incorporates those localized conditions. Now in the future, the model will continue to be calibrated. If you have additional input or volumes that can be provided to the modeling staff, that's always helpful as well. But that's kind of how localized water, surface water applied surface water is taken into consideration in these levels.
And then, Michael, one last question. For some reason, those orange lines, and then let's say these three examples, all have a point of diminishing returns as they go further to the right. I'm just trying to, I guess it's just a doomsday scenario. We don't see a, tremendous uptick in that at any point. We just see a point of, I guess 2070 is a hell of a year to live in these areas, apparently.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I think the big thing to take into consideration here is the vertical axis scale. You know, we're going from, say, in 2000 to 2005, we're around 70 feet roughly. Well, here we're around, I don't know, upper 50s here, but that's over, you know, a 60-year period plus. So even though there is a slight decline, the way the undesirable results and the conditions in the basin, that doesn't necessarily mean this is a bad condition. It just means water levels are a few feet lower than where they were 50 years ago.
True, but I'm saying, wouldn't I take that back to 1800 and figure that it would have been a 6-foot deep lake?
I mean, I wasn't there then. It could have been. I mean, it balances.
I'm just trying to question the modeling.
So,
sorry, Mike. I was just going to see if I could help.
I mean, yeah.
I mean, the orange line is a simulation, right? So and typically when you're modeling groundwater elevations, especially projected conditions, not knowing what the hydrology is, because I mean, none of us have these perfect crystal balls, so we don't know, you know, we headed for a huge long drought at that time or not. We typically just repeat historical records. And so part of it is artificial. Yes, part of it is what period did you select to repeat for your hydrologic sequence, and did it happen to end on a drought period? So that's one thing I would just bring up. I would also remind you that the important factor is it doesn't go below the MT. And then also that you really, I disagree with DWR personally on this requirement to project out to 2070. It's just ridiculous. It's not, it's simply in my book an exercise that is not very useful. But also recognizing that you will be having 5-year updates moving forward. And even after 2042, you will probably still be updating these GSPs and hence your modeling situation. So I wouldn't stress a whole lot about what the conditions are 2040 to 2070, but really focus in on what is being predicted between now and 2042.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie. And I would also add to that no model is 100% accurate. And so the more data that we collect and the more this is revised, the better the model is going to get. But again, this is also just based on conditions before Sigma was implemented. So we also have projects and management actions, a huge part of the GSP, that if levels were to get around their minimum thresholds, the GSA can take those actions or implement those projects to help correct some of these issues that might occur in the future. That's hypothetical. I'm not saying that's going to happen. But that's why the PMA section is such a big part of Sigma as it is.
Micah, I'd like to just take a time check here.
Yes.
And Brian, my sense is that we really do need to focus in on the SMC today because we're seeking recommendations. I don't know that it looks like we won't have time for the PMA discussion. And I just wanted to get you to weigh in on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We've got to get the questions here. Let's do our best to get this complete. If there's time, I can cover, there's 3 slides that I would like to quickly cover that just remind people which PMAs we're writing up. And I can cover in just a couple minutes so that people remember that. But if we don't have time for that, that's fine. We need to get through this.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Micah, and just so you know, yes, we are sort of running low on time.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so that was a good question. Thank you. I believe that was Danny. Any other quick questions on this before we move on to the recommendations, just to get feedback? Jim.
There we go. Yeah, during the past year, I've unsuccessfully asked the Nature Conservancy and other Sigma consultants to examine the accepted botanical fact that mature valley oak groves can pull water from as deep as 80 feet below the surface. And amongst other citations I've provided consultants is from the U.S. Forest Service Index of Species Information for valley oak, where they discuss the dimorphic nature of the valley oak root system. And I wonder if the 30-foot cutoff has to do just with the shallow portion of the root system. To quote from the document, vertical root depth have been measured as deep as 80 feet in some individuals. Historically, these forests extended up to 5 miles on each side of the rivers, and they once covered extensive areas extending through lowlands into the foothills. Valley oak woodland forest occupies about 1.5% of the historic acreage in the Sacramento River system. Mature valley oaks have died in some areas because of greatly lowered water tables. They're resistant to short-term drought, and mature groves suffer through damage only when lower water tables decline to extreme depths. Remaining valley oak woodland areas comprise critical habitat, which is intensively used by wildlife. And so to get valley oak woodlands as considered as groundwater dependent ecosystems rather than just the riparian zones that hug the streams and canals, I think is really a critical component to protecting what's left of this critical habitat. And so I'm just curious, why are we cutting it off at 30 feet when the scientific consensus is mature groves can benefit from groundwater levels that are considerably deeper and provide habitat not just for valley oaks, but for a wide array of botanical and animal species?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit. Thank you for your comment. I know that pretty much every GSP that I am aware of utilizes the work done by the Nature Conservancy, which is also the recommendation of DWR, to look at where potential groundwater dependent ecosystems are. And so in focusing on those habitats, we've relied on that Nature Conservancy GIS file and the information and data that they provided with that to address that for our GSPs, because it's just out of, we run out of resources in putting these plans together in terms of doing a full GDE assessment. So thankfully, the Nature Conservancy has provided a lot of that data and work for us. I can also say that our recommendation moving forward during the implementation period of the GSP is to increase that shallow monitoring network, those 10 locations that we brought up in the map. And I would also say that the 30 feet helps be protective of the potential GDEs that have been identified by the Nature Conservancy. So I understand that. No, go ahead.
Could I just kind of build on what you said?
Yep.
You're absolutely correct. There are species, especially oak species, that do root deeper than 30 feet. And that has been generally acknowledged across the board. First and foremost, you have to remember that what we're looking at here are SMC related to, especially minimum thresholds related to interconnected surface waters, not GDEs. GDEs are considered a user of groundwater, just like any other entity in the basin. So for the purposes of interconnected surface waters, we are looking at more of these shallower communities. What does need to happen, and as Micah just pointed out, and it's true across the board, for the most part, is that because of time limitations and funding limitations, we're not able to actually go out and have boots on the ground confirming where these communities exist. And that is something that is a data gap and should be included and considered as a future project to go and map them. And then have those areas then look at your minimum thresholds relative to protecting those communities once you've actually identified specifically where they're located, relative to how you set the minimum thresholds and measurable objectives in those areas. But it's important to separate in your mind the difference between monitoring for interconnected surface waters and GDE as a community specifically. So that's where the 30-foot threshold comes in. It's that the majority of the plant species root shallower than 30 feet. And so we're at this point trying to capture the most we can with the data sets available. And then we're going to have to go back in future updates and refine and improve.
Yeah, thank you, Leslie.
Well, thank you for that explanation and the disconnecting it from the entire groundwater dependent ecosystem world and limiting it to what's considered the ones that are just associated directly with stream flow. I'm just concerned that what's going to happen in the Sacramento Valley is what has already happened in the San Joaquin Valley, which due to the dropping of aquifers down there, they've lost hundreds of thousands of acre feet of valley oak woodlands. And I'm very concerned that Sigma is ignoring that fact and that we may see similar effects here in the Sacramento Valley. And that's why I try to bring it up occasionally in these very important meetings. So,
you know, if you have, oh, I'm sorry.
So thank you for recognizing that what I'm saying is not, I'm not just pulling it out of the air. It's actually part of the scientific consensus.
And it is, and if you have any documentation, for example, biological surveys that have been done in support of projects or anything that can provide information as to where these communities have been mapped in the basin, then I think I would love to see that information.
Something I've been trying to get. So we'll see if we can get that done. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Go on, Micah.
All right. So again, just our and thank you, Jim, for your input. Just to move along here, this is our recommendation slide. Again, the summary. We'll be asking each of the GSAs and their input. To quickly go over it, we'd like to set the minimum threshold at 10 feet deeper than the 2015 low. We'd like to use the same MO calculation as the last 5 years of measurement. And our UR detection, again, is 25% of wells fall below that minimum threshold line for 24 consecutive months before an undissolved result occurs. For reference, that's 3 of the 12 wells in this area. We also acknowledge that there are some data gaps that we would like to fill in the future and establish new GDE monitoring networks with new shallow wells during the implementation period. Deborah.
I'm just going back to what somebody said at the beginning, and they were talking, I think it was Anjanette, when she asked whether or not you had the measurement from 1977. Do we know if the 2015 measurement is lower than the 1977 measurement?
I do not know that information off the top of my head, but I do know that if the 77 drought period has records for each of these wells, those are included into the calculation.
Okay, I'm just curious which is lower and how we're setting it, since this drought is looking to be quite historic.
Yeah.
Deborah, I think if you look at that reference document again, it shows the period of record for the wells, so that might be helpful.
Thanks, Anjanette. Thank you.
Any other questions before we, and thank you, great question. Any other questions before we move on to getting yay or nay, thumbs up, thumbs down?
I'm not seeing any. Okay, so again, with this SMC for this sustainability indicator for depletions of interconnected surface water, you see on the screen what the recommendation is. I'd like to check in with each of you and to see, again, as Micah said, your yay or nay on what the team has recommended. I will go in reverse order and start with Biggs, alphabetical order, and start with Biggs West Gridley Water District. Cheryl Gordon, do you support this recommendation?
Yes, we support the recommendation.
Thank you, Cheryl. Butte County Supervisor Lucero.
Yes, I just have a question about what Mr. Brobeck brought up and what I'm sorry, Ms. Dumas, is it, was talking about. would there be any other recommendation that would need to come under this particular recommendation, or would that come under a different recommendation, or would that just be a separate PMA?
For the deeper
I'm not sure who that.
in GDEs.
That and probably the additional shallow monitoring wells.
Okay, so do you believe, Leslie, that that these recommendations cover what Mr. Brobeck said?
I think they do, provided we add the additional shallow monitoring wells, which is the last bullet on the slide there, as well as I just maybe perhaps modify fill data gaps using additional shallow wells, and I would add something along the lines of perhaps additional biological surveys or something like that to confirm these Valley Oak communities.
Okay, is that something we can do? Would that be okay to add that?
Now you're getting into the realm of PMAs, Brian.
Yeah, I think we can add that management action if that's what people would like to have some additional. It's unfortunate that I think Kelly Peterson and Butte County were working on the GDAs, but I don't see her on the call today. So.
Brian, you could make it even broader and just say confirm and refine GDE mapping. And that's actually been a very common data gap management action that pretty much every other GSP I've seen has included in their document.
And Jeanette, do you have a follow-up?
Well, I think Leslie just said it. It's the first GSP out the door. There's going to be data gaps, and I think everybody's committed to making sure that we're using sound science in any of the recommendations.
Mm-hmm. And so it sounds like we can continue this conversation, Deborah, when we take up PMAs, which will happen next, right? So we won't lose track of this, and Leslie has given us some language to do that. So let me just revisit this one more time with you, Deborah, regarding this recommendation. Do you support what's being recommended here for the SMC on interconnected surface waters?
Yes.
Thank you. Going to Butte Water District, Shelley Davis.
Yes, we're in support.
Thank you, Shelley. City of Biggs, Bo Shepherd.
Yes.
Thank you. City of Gridley, Mike Farr.
Yes, yeah, we accept it.
Thank you, Mike. CGA, Colusa Groundwater Authority, Denise Carter.
Yes.
Thank you, Supervisor Carter. Glenn County, Supervisor Hahn, Ken Hahn.
Yes.
Thank you, Ken. RD 1004, Hans Herkert.
Yes, in support.
Thank you, Hans. RD 2106, Danny Robinson.
Yes.
Thank you, Danny. Richvale Irrigation District, Gary Stone.
Yes, we're in support. I did hear from Sean, though there are a couple wells in our district that we need to take a different look at, or a better look at.
Okay, thank you, Gary. It sounds like we can follow up just to clarify if the methodology that was applied to the groundwater level SMC in red on the slide would cover those concerns. So it sounds like we just need to follow up on that.
Correct.
Thank you, Gary. And Western Canal Water District, Greg Johnson?
Yes, we agree.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you all. Again, a very success for us to celebrate with this second SMC. Micah, continuing on.
Great, yes, thank you, everybody, really appreciate it. So next is a reduction in groundwater storage. We recommend using levels as a proxy. Change in storage that has occurred has been pretty small in the basin compared to the portion of available storage. And really the limiting factor to storage use is the existing well infrastructure and near surface conditions, not the volume of storage in the subbasin. So therefore we'd like to use level thresholds because they are protective against significant and unreasonable changes in storage in this basin. So our recommendation, this is a quick one because we're already here, is monitoring and managed by proxy using groundwater levels. Any questions on this?
I don't see any questions. And just to clarify, Micah, my observation is that this is often used in other GSPs as well, right? Using this. Yes, okay. Thank you. I don't see any questions. So in terms of the recommendation for storage, the recommendation is to use groundwater levels as a proxy. Let's go through this roll call again, reverse order, starting with Western Canal Water District. Greg Johnson, do you support this recommendation for storage SMC?
I would support it.
Thank you, Greg. Richvale, Gary?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. RD 2106, Danny?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. RD 1004, Hans?
Yes.
Thank you, Hans. Glenn County Supervisor Hahn?
Yes, we do.
Thank you. CGA, Calusa Groundwater Authority, Supervisor Carter?
Yes.
Thank you. City of Gridley, Mike Farr?
Yes.
Thank you. City of Biggs, Bo Shepherd?
Yes.
Thank you. Butte Water District, Shelley Davis?
Yes.
Thank you. Butte County Supervisor Lucero?
Yes.
Thank you. Biggs West Gridley Water District, Cheryl Gordon?
Yes, we're in support.
Thank you. Excellent. Micah, moving on.
Great. Yes, thank you, everyone. That was easy. And I don't even think we need to take a consensus on this one. Seawater intrusion is not particularly applicable to our basin. We are not, it is not an indicator because seawater intrusion is not present and is not likely to occur in the Butte Subbasin due to distance between the subbasin and the Pacific Ocean, bays, deltas, or inlets. Therefore, there is no possibility of an undissolvable result due to seawater intrusion. That's the standard language that we'll be using in the plan. It's been used in many of the plans. It's pretty much pulled directly from the regs. So, yes.
Yes, we've had this conversation many times about seawater intrusion, and thus far the BAB has been supportive of the use of this language. I just want to clarify that I'd like to ask you, Micah, to clarify the difference between seawater intrusion and salinity as a groundwater constituent, groundwater quality constituent.
Yes, so salinity can still be covered under the groundwater quality sustainable management criteria. Seawater intrusion is specifically about those saline, the saline waters from the ocean, bays, deltas, inlets. That's how it's defined in the regulations. And because we're not near any of those bodies of water, this is just not an applicable sustainability indicator for the Butte Subbasin.
So I see that Ben King, your hand is up, and I asked that question to try to clarify to see if that would address what you might raise, but let's go to you, Ben.
Yeah, so I definitely understand the DWR's position on this. I would note that the Butte Basin was part of the Pacific Ocean at one point during the Cenozoic era, and there is research that there's connate seawater around the Southern Buttes, and the reason I think that's important to remember is that connate seawater is anoxic. Does that mean it's without oxygen? And there's issues, both chemical and biotic issues, when connate seawater actually upwells into the groundwater where oxygen starts relating to it. And then also there's microbial relationship between connate seawater or anoxic seawater and certain types of microbes, which actually release arsenic. And so there's issues. So for example, in Chesapeake Bay, there's arsenic contamination because of the anoxic or connate environment of the seawater. So I do have some comments about seawater quality, but I think it's important that the oxidation process of a connate seawater and how it may relate to upwelling of connate seawater that actually remains from the geological history around the Southern Buttes is something to be considered, because I believe that actually that is one of the reasons why we have arsenic around the Sutter Buttes.
Great comment. And yeah, I can tell you that those are addressed in the water quality, would be addressed in the water quality portion of the GSP, based on the definitions of seawater intrusion provided in the regulations.
Thank you for your comments, Ben, and for your response, Micah. Any further discussion on this before we move on from the BAB? Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Micah.
All right, now on to groundwater quality. So the key concern for groundwater quality in the Butte Subbasin is the upwelling of saline water. The technical team is recommending that we monitor the deep aquifer and establish a new groundwater quality monitoring network using the deep aquifer monitoring wells used for the levels monitoring network. So not drilling new wells or anything like that. The map on your screen actually has those deep aquifer monitoring wells back from the levels monitoring network. So there is no existing monitoring in the deep that is deep enough for the deep aquifer. The average depth of most of our wells is around 166 feet. The deepest depth is around 600 feet. The gamma network sites, which are presented on this map in orange, really only have 1 to 3 measurements of historical data that we have used to set, or have used to help us set some preliminary thresholds. But it's just not a lot of information to provide us really definitive thresholds with a lot of confidence moving forward. Not to say that we're not setting them or recommending them, but this is to prompt you all in thinking that in the next 5-year update, this is something that's going to need to be revisited and revised, and that's going to be something that DWR is looking for. The Butte Subbasin network provided in blue, the blue points on this map, also do not have a lot of well construction information, so we don't really know exactly where these wells were completed to know if we can utilize them for the deep aquifer well system. So here is the proposed new monitoring network for the deep aquifer, because we're looking at upwelling of that saline water, which is why we're not looking at the shallow wells. And we would collect readings using sensors or probes or special sampling technology to avoid purging of the wells. This reduced monitoring costs moving forward. But this is the network we're looking at. Now you can see we've actually removed 3 wells at the very top of the basin, just because there are several wells in this area and it's kind of duplicative, and it's not really, we don't need 4 measurements up in this one small area. We feel confident that 1 measurement up there is totally fine. So our recommendation moving forward is to set the minimum threshold at the higher concentration of either 900 microsiemens or the historical high measurement at that location. We'd like to set the measurable objective at 700 microsiemens for agricultural use. This is based on the basin management program value that's outlined in that report and plan. And an undesirable result detection would be 25%, or 3 of the 9 representative wells exceed the minimum threshold for 24 consecutive months. And again, this is with the understanding that as we collect more information over the next 5 years during implementation, that these can be revised at that 5-year update. These values provided now are based on nearby basins, their inputs, or what their strategies moving forward. Some are pulled by the measurable objective uses that basin management program plan. So that's why we're recommending these today.
Thank you, Micah. BAB members, are there any questions before I go to you and ask you if you support this recommendation? Supervisor Lucero.
I was just wondering because Micah, you were kind of cutting in and out, for me at least, on the 900 cm. You were saying something that this was in some of the other basins. This is the higher level of that. That I couldn't quite catch that.
Oh, I was just saying that some of the other basins in the Sacramento Valley use these or similar thresholds. So because we don't have a lot of historical data to back up setting these thresholds specifically in our basin, the historical record just isn't there. We're utilizing that coordination among subbasins in the general area to help us set these thresholds. We've received feedback in the past that putting thresholds on this sustainability indicator is really important. Before, we were going to try and just push it off to the 5-year update once we received additional information through the sampling. But we were directed, which is totally fine, to set thresholds now. So we feel that these are good places to start, knowing that we'll be revising them again in 5 years. But these show consistency with other subbasins and with other plans and constituent levels that have been brought up in other areas.
Okay.
Deborah, did that help answer your question? Did you have any
I just
follow-up
don't
there?
feel, well, I just don't feel real confident about, what we're measuring it against, and, if this is good, if it's not good, if, I don't, I would have to depend on these experts for this, because I'm uncertain about what these objectives and thresholds should be in this particular instance.
I understand it. I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, let me ask if there are other BAB members who have questions about this that they'd like to raise before I go to members of the public. I see your hand is up, Ben. I'll come to you in a moment. And Jeanette?
Yeah, we talked about this, I think, at depth with Christina, and unfortunately she's not here. And for the information we have and what we've used, oh, Paul's got his hand up, so maybe he knows, but what we've done in the BMO and what we've done with the water quality testing annually, that these look good, but I'll let Paul say more.
Sure,
Go ahead,
thanks.
Paul.
Yeah, I was going to mention the BMO program. I believe these are consistent with what we've used for the BMO program for saline intrusion, but I think also back to Supervisor Lucero's comment, I think it'd be real helpful in the draft, and I imagine you do this, is a little bit more explanation about what these standards are and what they're based on impacts, let's say, to agriculture or drinking water quality.
Yeah, I just want to add, Mike, I think that in the earlier meeting, we selected these based on feedback from Christina, and that these would be consistent with the basin management program.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Yeah, that's that's where some of these values came from. And the 900 microsiemens is more stringent than the long-term drinking water MCL. So we're kind of utilizing the BMO, MCL considerations for protective of drinking water, and historical data, if that's the way we want to go.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Ben King?
Yeah, so I would just say, I think these are, quite, I guess, aggressive, or, if you can maintain those levels, that's great within the basin. I'd like to point out that, I looked at the most recent Gamma study, which I believe is 2006. There's a well on Laux Road, just it's in Sutter County, but it's real close to the Butte Basin. They're just, I believe it's right on the on Butte Slough or Butte Creek. And if I read it right, it has a depth of 369 feet, but it had a specific conductance of 2380 and a TDS of 1290. So, and that is, how the basin, it's sort of a function of how the basin extends down, but the work done by Stephen Springhorn around the Sutter Buttes, speculates that the fresh water level is less than 500 feet around that area. So I kind of wonder if you're being too aggressive for the existing conditions of salt water at the southwestern part of the basin. But I would point out that you might want to look at the 2006 Gamma study and look at EASC 21. It really looks to me like it's actually finding connate water less than 500 feet. And so I commend you on your objectives here, and it's great to see that the Butte Basin has such a feeling of that they have a good water quality. But given that we probably do have shallow depths around the basin, and then also with the speculation that the Sutter Beach Rampart extends at least 10 miles north of the Buttes, you might want to look at actually do some more testing around the interaction between the Buttes and the freshwater saltwater interface within that rampart. Thank you.
Paul, did you have a, thank you, Ben. Paul, did you have a follow-up?
Ben's made a lot of good points about those conditions down the southeast portion of the basin, and I think there is going to be, follow-up monitoring to be evaluated the first 5 years. So it might be also, and I'll throw this out to the technical team, an appropriate consideration if this area is very unique in terms of some of the water quality conditions. Would that eventually maybe constitute it being its own management area and how we deal with saline intrusion?
Any thoughts from the technical team?
I think that's something that and I'll defer maybe to Leslie and Micah here too, but I think that's something that we would evaluate and should be evaluated between now and the first update. I mean, we've talked about the monitoring network and extending the monitoring network, and we'll be collecting data during that time. And I think that's definitely one thing that will be on the list to evaluate at that time.
I agree with Brian, and I think that it would be a good thing we would have to make sure we document it in the plan implementation section of the GSP. And I typically recommend that if you're going to err on one side or the other, you err in this first go round of being more on the general side, because it's easier to refine it in future iterations versus going the other direction. And a management area would be definitely one way to handle that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for all that follow-up. And Ben, is that an old hand or did you have a follow-up?
It's an old hand.
Okay, thank you. I'll lower it. All right, any further discussion before I go to all of you for you to weigh in on this recommendation?
Yes, I had just a quick question here from Biggs. So in the event that we were going to try and do more monitoring in the basin, are the resources available to do that? Or is that something that we have to build in the resources to do that?
Paul, you might have a follow-up on this. I believe Christina has spoken about this in the past. Paul? Yeah,
and if I can keep my notes together, and I hope I'm consistent, but I think as the water quality program expands, that might need a additional set of resources and commitment if we're going to continue to do that. But I think part of the ongoing water quality monitoring is something we would continue as part of our monitoring program. But it's also going to have to be part of the implementation evaluation as we start thinking about these additional things, what existing commitments the GSAs are already bringing to the table. And if they're beyond that, then that's going to need its own resource and funding source to carry out those things the basin needs to carry out the plan.
So if I might just summarize there, it sounds like under the existing water quality monitoring program, this could, at least part of this could be supported through that program, but this is an ongoing conversation. And when we get to PMA's implementation, how to fill data gaps, that's going to be, we're going to have more in-depth conversations about funding. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
I'm sorry, I know we're at 3 and I'm hoping we can push through this SMC. And so I'm just going to move forward, and you can please let me know if you have to drop off. But let's have you weigh in on this this recommendation, starting with Western Canal Water District. The recommendation that is being made here about the water quality SMC. Greg Johnson, let us know how you feel about this. Do you support this recommendation, Greg?
Sorry about that. It took me a second to find my mute. Well, I'm a little bit in the dark about it, but so far I'm okay with it for now, thinking that it's going to probably change in the future.
Yeah, yes. And remember that this is going to be written up in the draft chapter, and a full description of it will hopefully create more clarity to the extent that there can be clarity at this moment in time. So thank you for letting us know, Greg, where you are with this right now. Richvale Irrigation District.
Yeah, we approve.
Thank you. RD 2106.
Yes, we approve.
Yeah. Thank you, Danny. RD 1004.
Yeah, I share similar concerns, or the same concerns that Mr. King does related to the water quality. And at this point, I just don't know if I've got enough information to support it based on how the water quality is or has potential to be in the southern area there.
Yes, Hans, I appreciate that. And do you think having more time and seeing it fully written up in the chapter may, the draft chapter on SMC would be sort of the next step for you to think about it and for your GSA to make any additional comments? Does that feel comfortable sort of moving forward to the draft chapter using this recommendation?
Yes.
Thank you. Glenn County Supervisor Hahn.
Yes, we support.
Thank you, CGA.
Yes,
Carter.
I'll support, but with the caveat that I as well would be interested in some background information on how they got to where this recommendation. So wait for the draft report.
Great, thank you, Supervisor Carter. And City of Gridley, Mike Farr.
Yeah, first of all, I'm representing the City of Gridley. Groundwater quality is very important to us, and our water comes from wells. So tentatively, I support it, but would sure like to be able to mull it around and read more what the proposals are.
Yes, oh, thank you for that, Mike. It sounds like folks will really appreciate having a more robust understanding of this and looking deeply at the chapter for more context. City of Biggs, Bo Shepherd.
Yes, and I would just concur with what's been said, past remarks.
Thank you. And Butte Water District, Shelley Davis.
Yes, we're in support.
Butte County, thank you. Deborah Lucero.
Yes.
Thank you, Deborah. Biggs West Gridley Water District, Cheryl Gordon.
Yes, with what everyone else has stated, or a lot of others had stated, with additional information on how these numbers were arrived at.
Okay, and thank you, Cheryl. All right, where are we, Micah, in this presentation?
We just have land subsidence left. And
This is just land subsidence.
Just land
okay.
Subsidence, and then I have a summary slide for everyone to look at if they're interested, but just land subsidence.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Micah.
All right, so I appreciate you all sticking around for this. We'll get through it quickly. We're looking at inelastic land subsidence for the last sustainability indicator. Historical subsidence has been very small, about 0.0325 feet for every 5 years, which is pretty good, really good. So we've established a representative network using DWR's Sacramento Valley GPS subsidence network and monitoring locations within the Butte Subbasin. A lot of the, I'm blanking on the word, Leslie help me, the benchmarks around the subbasin. So because subsidence has been historically very low in the past, we recommend continuing to use the current monitoring network, the Sacramento Valley Subsidence Network. We recommend setting the minimum threshold at 1/2 foot for every 5 years, which is consistent with our neighbors in the Yuba GSP areas, and setting the MO at 1/4 foot for every 5 years, which is also consistent with Yuba. So this is our recommendation slide. We acknowledge that subsidence is not really occurring in the Butte Subbasin. We will use DWR Sacramento Valley GPS subsidence network for the representative sites. MT is 1/2 foot. MO is 1/4 foot. It's over 5 years. And our undesirable result detection is 25% of monitoring network points fall below the MT. And that's not for 24 consecutive months, because our time frame, these monitoring points are monitored every 5 years. So it's just if it happens, but we don't really foresee that happening considering the historical rate. So any questions on this?
Thank you. Thank you, Micah. Yes, let's go to the BAB. Any questions before you weigh in on this recommendation?
Oops.
Yes, Deborah Lucero?
Yeah, I just, you said in, excuse me, surrounding basins have similar measurements. How do those compare to, say, a place where subsidence is already substantial?
Like in the San Joaquin Valley?
Yeah, or on the west side where we see, it seems on the west side there is more subsidence than on the east side. Is that generally true, or?
Yes, but again, in looking at all the points in the Butte Subbasin, it's about 10 millimeters every 5 years or less. So it really isn't much of a concern in this basin. Colusa does have a few little spots where it could be impactful, but places like Yuba, it's not a concern at all. In the San Joaquin Valley, I believe, and Leslie knows more about subsidence in that area, but Leslie, was it like 1/2 foot a year?
Yeah, in some places over towards the Red Top area, for example, in the Madera and Chowchilla basins, it's even more.
Yeah.
So they've set their measurable objectives. They basically, for the most part, have set their measurable objectives at almost zero, like 0.1 foot, like just almost negligible. And then the minimum threshold varies considerably, and it's actually a point of contention amongst some of the subbasins.
I'm just wondering, I guess my question is it just acceptable to have any subsidence? Is this something, it would seem like, subsidence is something that is definitely a negative. You can't get that back. So I'm just wondering, why we are putting so much space in there, I guess.
Well, I mean, having talked with, for example, DWR, we met because the Delta Mendota Subbasin has the Delta Mendota Canal, which is part of the CVP, as you know, and then the California Aqueduct is part of the State Water Project. We've actually talked with the managers of the State Water Project at DWR, and a lot of the main big infrastructures are actually designed to accommodate some subsidence, because it just life happens, and the natural lowering and decreasing of groundwater elevations affect that. But what happened in the San Joaquin Valley is it obviously was far more than what they anticipated it, or it had been planned for, which is what's causing a lot of the problems. And now one of the things I am looking at right now, and I have it on my screen, is because I'm working in the Sutter Subbasin, based on the data we have there, there's practically, like here, no subsidence has occurred. But because we abut the Yolo Subbasin, we did take a look at what's happening in the Yolo Subbasin, and there is some subsidence happening there. And they've set their measurable, their minimum thresholds by various reaches of creeks for some reason. I'm not quite sure why, but they did. And, oh wait, that may be because I'm in the wrong one. And I'm trying to take a look here at what they said. I don't know, that's right. They haven't established their minimum thresholds yet. That's it. But they're looking at, in some cases, between 0, their minimum thresholds are being set between 0 and 2.5 centimeters per year over 25% of the management area. So they've created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 management areas and established different minimum thresholds and measurable objectives using running averages for subsidence in those areas. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, I'm just wondering like how we came up with this particular measurement, you know.
Yeah, so yeah, again, we used when we look at our neighbors around the subbasin, we most closely reflect in terms of subsidence what's happening in Yuba. And so to be consistent with the Yuba GSP, that's why we've chosen 1/2 foot and 1/4 foot as our MT and MO respectively. So, and as Leslie said, subsidence is really only an issue. 2 big things subsidence is an issue for is infrastructure, mostly like canals, and losses to groundwater storage. Storage isn't really an issue for us because we have a lot of it. It just depends on the well infrastructure and being able to access it. But also the rate of subsidence that's currently happening is not a big deal for any of the infrastructure that we see in Butte Subbasin at all. You know, this little amount isn't going to impact pretty much any infrastructure. And so we're looking at being protective of the basin in terms of significant and unreasonable subsidence. A little bit is fine and usually pretty natural. So that's the 1/2 foot and 1/4 foot is to be consistent with Yuba, which is very representative or similar in terms of subsidence rates in our basin. And we don't see any significant or unreasonable results happening from the current rate or even the rate of these thresholds in the basin.
Let's get Anjanette into this conversation. Anjanette?
Well, Micah just covered everything I was just going to say, so thank you, Micah.
Great.
Okay, and is that an old hand or do you have a follow-up, Deborah? Okay, all right. Any further discussion on this SMC, on this recommendation?
I would also add, if you look at the very last sentence on this slide, DWR puts out INSAR data annually. And so it's not like every 5 years, it's going to be a big surprise if there's subsidence in the basin. It's as easy as looking at the Sigma data viewer online for anybody. And we can take a look at the annual changes. So it's something that will definitely be looked at on an annual basis, but the representative points we are using to define undesirable results in our threshold networks are these particular locations. The INSAR data is just something we're going to be looking at to make sure there's no big surprises, but like I said, we don't foresee. I just wanted to add that clarification.
Okay, thank you, Micah. I don't see any other hands, so I'm just going to ask for us to check in on this recommendation. Again, like we have with the others, this is the last one. And I will start with Biggs West Gridley Water District. Do you support this recommendation?
Yes, we do.
Thank you, Cheryl. Butte County Supervisor Lucero.
I'm supporting it. I just, again, I'm having to depend on, you know, experts here. It makes me a little uncomfortable to suggest that subsidence is okay in any instance, but I'm going to default to the experts. So I will support it with the idea that every 24 months, if DWR is putting out information, we would know, and I guess it would be triggered at a quarter foot. Is that what I'm reading, at 25% of monitoring points?
Yeah.
Is that how it works?
Every 5 years. Yeah.
Every 5 years. So for instance, if it did happen, we were triggering at 24 months, then we would wait another 2.5 years before we did anything.
No. So the monitoring points are only monitored on a 5-year schedule. And so there's no 24 consecutive months clause in this undesirable result identification. The INSAR data that we would be looking at is just to make sure that we don't have any surprises at that 5-year. But it is, if there's more than a quarter foot in 25% of the monitoring sites, or more than half a foot at a quarter of the monitoring sites at that 5-year period, then we would be in an undesirable results like immediately. It wouldn't be a surprise though, because we would be looking at the inside.
Paul, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, and I think along those lines, it might be helpful in this section to describe the INSAR data, which we will get annually, and that if we start to see, you know, 1/100th of a foot drop in INSAR data, which is still outside the norm, that would trigger, you know, an investigation or evaluation as to what's going on. So I think having
that discussion in the section.
Oh, it is.
Yeah, maybe just. Oh, it is in there. Okay, well that would be more helpful. I mean, it would make me feel better if there was something like that in the draft.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. I'm
Okay,
for this with language that defines it just a little bit better. I'm just reading what is up here on the slide. Thank you.
Abbreviated version, yeah.
Thank you, Deborah. That was helpful. Thank you, Deborah. And it sounds like some of that language will be in the chapter. So when looking at the chapter, the BAB members will want to make sure, if that's a concern of yours, that you take a close look at that. Going on to the Butte Water District, Shelley Davis.
Yes, we're in support.
Thank you, Shelley. City of Biggs, Bo Shepherd.
Yes, we're in support. Thank you.
Thank you. City of Gridley, Mike Farr.
Yes, we're in support. You know, we are going to rely heavily on our monitoring systems and our experts to make sure that they keep us abreast of what's going on, which obviously they are at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Colusa Groundwater Authority.
Yes.
Thank you, Supervisor Carter. Glenn County, Supervisor Hahn.
Yes, we're in support.
Thank you. RD 1004, Hans Herkert.
Yes, in support.
Thank you, Hans. RD 2106, Danny Robinson.
Yes, we are in support.
Thank you. Richvale Irrigation District, Gary Stone.
Yes, we're in support.
Thank you, Gary. And Western Canal Water District, Greg Johnson.
Yes, we're in support.
Thank you, all of you, and thank you so much for staying late. We have gotten to the through all of the SMC. You can see here there's a summary slide, and we also the technical team also provided a summary table that was in your materials. Micah, did you want to say anything about this to wrap up the SMC discussion?
Only that this is the summary of everything we went over. I obviously have not had a chance to update the MT portion of the groundwater levels based on our discussion. That red text I added in the slide up above, so we can update that and send it out. But other than that, this is everything that we've been talking about today, and I'd just like to say a huge thank you. This is a huge chunk of the GSP preparation and allows for a lot of things to start moving forward. And I thought all the questions were really helpful, all the public comments. So really, thank you. You guys make this a very much easier process than a lot of other basins I've worked in. So I really appreciate all your cooperation and questions and respect moving forward. So thanks, guys.
Thank you very much, Micah. And we have, just in terms of the outcomes from this discussion, as Micah just mentioned, they will update this table to reflect the changes that emerged from the groundwater levels SMC discussion. We've taken note of several areas where you have some concerns or would like for there to be more discussion in the chapter to address some of the concerns that you raised. And also earlier, we talked about the need to update the hydrographs based on the changes that were discussed for the groundwater level SMC. And also Deborah Lucero suggested, just to make it more user-friendly, to include page numbers. So I think that those were the main things that did come out of that in terms of immediate next steps. We are going to take up the projects and management actions discussion next time. I'm very sorry, Brian, that we weren't able to get to that today. I would just like to have you all take a look at, we're not going to do it now because we're over time, take a look at the schedule that is attached to the agenda. And we did make some changes. It was based on, you know, where we're going with the GSP, realizing what needs to happen in the next few months. You can expect to receive some communications from the Consensus Building Institute to get any and all meetings on your calendar through December. And so you will be getting a communication to make sure that we schedule the December meeting that is not yet on your calendars. So the other thing is, and we won't be able to go into great depth about it today, but one thing that is really important now that these are the first round of recommendations, of significant recommendations that the BAB has made. You as representatives of your elected representatives of your decision-making bodies are taking these recommendations to your boards, to your city councils, to make sure that they are staying informed. And what we would really like to know is what information needs do you have to help you be successful in carrying this forward to your GSA boards. And if we could just take a few minutes to give us input about what information the technical team and CBI can provide you to make that a streamlined process, we'd really like to get that feedback from you. BAB members, any thoughts? Do you feel like you have the information you need? Any suggestions for us?
If I could just go ahead, City of Biggs, we have a few new council members, and so Mark and I would have to really talk about that and see what other information beyond what's provided on the website. So I guess the simple question is we'd have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, thanks for letting us know, Bo. And it's really important what you just raised, that you do have some new council members where just Sigma, it may all just be alphabet soup to them. And so as you and Mark talk about that, maybe you could just be in touch with us to let us know how we could assist you. Anyone else?
I would just say that it's great to have that the acronyms, you know, at your disposal, you know, like right up front, page numbers so that you can refer very readily to things. And a map is always really helpful. A map of the overall area, just starting out visually with what are we looking at, what are the boundaries, just an overall, almost like a here's the Butte Basin, here's what we're looking at, here's what we rely on, you know, like the information about the wells, because that always comes up. We're relying on information from DWR, which we know is not reliable. There are some assumptions, you know, these are the assumptions that we make.
Okay, thank you, Deborah. That's all very good feedback. And any other thoughts, what you would need to help you convey this information to your decision-making bodies?
Yeah, this is Mike Farr from Gridley. You know, being a city, of course, we're very concerned with water quality and our threshold level. And as we refine this as we go forward, it might, or it would be, I believe, advantage to the people in Gridley and Biggs and sounds around us, to have maybe Brian come and give a little presentation and bring it down to earth so that people might understand some of the things that we're talking about.
Okay, we can talk to the technical team, our planning team, about the possibility of that kind of support. Thanks, Mike. Okay, anyone else? Any other ideas? All right. Before we wrap it up today, are there any critical updates from any of the GSAs that would be important to share with the full advisory board? Okay, I'm not hearing any.
I'll
Paul.
just mention joining Subbasin, Wyandotte Creek Subbasin, released their draft SMC for public comment today. And Vina, his comment period ends on the 18th.
Okay, thank you for that update. I'm not hearing any other critical updates. Brian, could I hand it off to you as the project manager from the technical team to, if you have, to share with us if you have any final thoughts?
Thank you, Tanya. I appreciate everybody's input and the robust discussion today. Is a real milestone to get these recommendations approved, allows us to move forward and get the draft SMC together and out for people to review. And I just really appreciate feedback and working together with this group to get the good GSP and good threshold set for everybody here. So thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you all. Thank you for staying long, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you with any follow-up and to our next meeting. And I guess that's just the one thing that while we weren't going to spend a lot of time on the schedule, I should just be clear with you about when that next meeting is. And I don't think that we will be meeting until August. There will be, is that right, Brian? Yeah, that's right.
I think that's right.
That's right. That's right. Because there will be several chapters that will be released, and we'll want to make sure that you benefit from being able to allow public comment to take place, so that when you come and that you're able to review the chapters yourselves before we come back together. If that needs to change because we didn't get to the PMA today and we need to set up a new meeting, an additional meeting, we'll be sure to let you know that, and I'll need to check in with Brian and the planning team on that question. Cheryl, I see your hand is up. Cheryl Gordon.
I just had one question in regards to the release of what we just did. Are the general public going to be notified in some form of the release of what we just did so that they can make public comment? How is that going to work? Can you go over that real quick for me?
Yeah, sure. So we're going to take this. We're working on the draft SMC chapter at the moment. And this allows us to move forward with these recommendations put in the chapter for what the thresholds are going to be. We've got a lot of the backup supporting information already drafted. So the schedule is for that to come out on June 15th. And when I say come out, it's to go to the GSA managers and internally here for review. And then we have a meeting with the GSA managers again here at the end of the month. I forget the exact date, to go over any comments that they have for that we would then incorporate into a draft to go out for public review on or about July 1st.
And the public will be, Cheryl, the public will be notified through all the interested parties lists. The chapters will be on the website, the Butte Subbasin groundwater website, and all of that will be sent out to you, as well as through the Butte County has a large list, and each of the GSAs has their own interested parties list. And how to submit comments will be clearly identified in that communication.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I might mention
Thank
that
you,
the
Cheryl.
PMA chapter is on the same schedule.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And Jeanette?
Well, I think you just covered it. I mean, each of us GSAs are responsible for our own constituents. It'll be on the website. So I would just make sure that your interested parties list is what it is or what Biggs West Gridley is using, because we can't just depend on Glenn County and Butte County to get it out to everyone.
Yep. Thank you for noting that, Anjanette. Okay, any final comments about what's next here? Okay, everyone, thank you again. Have a good rest of the day, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you all. Take
Thank you
care.
all. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.